changes made to the 2019 adult population survey and the results from the changes made last year. Just wanted to clarify this point on today's webinar being about the 2019 survey. As hopefully everyone knows, GEM currently has a task force in place that is working right now to determine which changes should be made to the 2020 adult population survey in light of coronavirus, which will certainly have an impact on data collection and perhaps the motivations of entrepreneurs, and we want to capture that. So today is about the 2019 survey, and with that in mind, I wanted to introduce Jonathan Levy, member of the GEM UK team, REACT member, and professor of entrepreneurship and regional development at the National University of Ireland at Galway. Jonathan has been involved with GEM since the very beginning of GEM, starting in the late 90s and early 2000s, and has been instrumental in how the organization analyzes the vast amount of data we collect annually. Jonathan also spearheaded the efforts to revise the adult population survey in 2019 with some adjustments on how we asked our previous questions, in addition to a couple new survey questions. As a result, we've been able to better distinguish between different forms of entrepreneurship, including developing a new category, which Jonathan will talk about a bit, of entrepreneurs who identified as sponsored owner managers of business, which is distinct from independent owner managers of small businesses. Additionally, we have added a Likert scale for measuring general attitudes towards entrepreneurship, rather than the simple previous yes/no binary questions we had. And this helps us capture more nuance in the societal attitudes towards entrepreneurships. We've also added additional choices to the motivations of entrepreneurs they have for starting a new business. And finally, we've added a new geographically bound question for early stage entrepreneurs that differentiates if they're offering a new product or technology to their local market, national or international market. The key point of this being that in addition to, we've added this addition of the local designation, which captures data on the critical growth stage of stepping up from the local to the national stage for early stage entrepreneurs, which was previously missing. So with all that said, I'm going to hand things over to Jonathan to go through his slides and talk through the results of the 2019 changes. Then after that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you. So Jonathan, you can start when.
Okay, thanks, Forrest. Hi, everybody. I'm going to go through mainly the slides that I talked through at the planning meeting back in, when was it, February. And I've added a few more slides and done a couple of things since. If anybody's got a specific question that they want to ask me, which they think is, pressing and urgent, please just unmute your microphone and ask. But I'll rattle through this. I've got 15 slides and it'll probably take about 20 minutes. Okay. So let's see if I can change to, yeah, you should be able to see a different slide now, slide 2, which says, see my 37-page document. So I've just produced a version 2, which has the same number of pages, but there's actually more material in it. And it corrects a few typos and also one syntax error, which is, it doesn't change the results that much, but it's more accurate, that's for sure. So Forrest has a copy of that and he can send it out to everybody.
Yeah, after this discussion, I'll send it out to teams in that invitation email, so everyone will have that document.
Okay, great. Thanks, Forrest. Right, so here's the background. Forrest has already rattled through it. I'm going to talk about 4 things in this presentation. If people want to ask me about the mindset questions, I can talk about that afterwards. So as Forrest said, the first thing we've done is for the first time we can now distinguish between independent early stage entrepreneurial activity and sponsored early stage entrepreneurial activity. We used to be able to do this for nascent entrepreneurs, but for some reason not for new business entrepreneurs. So therefore, we weren't able to distinguish between independent and sponsored T entrepreneurs. So by adding a simple question, we've been able to reveal quite a lot, and I'll share some of that with you. And of course, we can now compare them with employee entrepreneurial activity. Secondly, we've introduced some motivation questions that are theory-driven, that are, I guess, a response to a lot of criticism in the literature of the necessity-opportunity dichotomy that we've used ever since GEM began. Thirdly, we've tweaked the attitude questions to yield richer information, and I'll give you some examples of what it has yielded. And then finally, we've tried tweaking our measures of impact, in particular, as far as mentioned, creating measures of scope, of market scope, and I guess scope of novelty, whether it's local or national or global. And that addresses some of the problems we've had before in trying to identify innovative entrepreneurs. So this took several years, and we pre-tested twice in Canada and again in Croatia. Some of these questions were also tested in the UK over a number of years, particularly the motivation questions. And in fact, the US has been asking its attitude questions in Likert scales for several years. Okay, so let's get into the some of the results from these changes. And the first one I'll show you is the prevalence of independent and sponsored early stage entrepreneurs and employee entrepreneurial activities. So, so this next slide, I hope you can see the numbers here. I've made them as big as possible. So this basically shows the prevalence of different types of entrepreneurs. And what we find is that over a third of T entrepreneurs are actually sponsored. So they're setting up or running a new business for their employers. They will have a stake in the business, but they're doing this for their employer. So it turns out that only 7.5% of the overall global sample in 2019 were independent early stage entrepreneurs, and another 4.5% were sponsored early stage entrepreneurs. And as we'll see in a minute, there are interesting differences between these two types of entrepreneurs, both in terms of their motivations and their impact. We see a kind of a similar breakdown for established business owner managers. About 5% of them are independent and about 3% are sponsored. And of course, they're more prevalent than entrepreneurs across the global sample. But one of the things you can see from this is that combinations of early stage and established business owners, or of entrepreneurs and other business owners, are really quite rare. And this is the first time we've been able to show this. We've been able to compare kind of like with like. And as you can see, this is a pretty big sample, 155,000 people altogether. If you're looking for this variable, it's up there at the top left-hand corner of the table, ENTRACT3, it's called. There are more fine-grained variables, but this is probably the most useful one, at least I think so anyway. So let's look and see whether there are differences in, for example, job expectation among these different types of entrepreneurs. So this just gives you an idea of the prevalence of high job creation expectation within each of these categories. And what you can see is that the independent early stage entrepreneurs tend to have a lower prevalence of high job creation expectation. That's the yellow colored numbers, and slightly higher prevalence among the sponsored early stage entrepreneurs. Higher prevalence again among the, perhaps you could call them portfolio entrepreneurs, the combinations of early stage and established business owners, and then the highest prevalence among the entrepreneurs. This again is across the whole sample. In this case, it's not weighted by sample size or country size. So the proportions might be a bit different if we weighted them properly by sample size and country size, but it certainly gives you an indication that there are interesting differences here. And I suspect that in most countries you will see these kinds of differences. Okay, so I'll just move to attitudes now. So we've changed, I think we've improved the way we measure attitudes. Before we had yes, no questions, and there was the option of a don't know, but that's always dropped along with the refuse to answer cases in GEM up to now. And the problem with that is that the proportion of don't knows in some countries was almost 50%. So in Sweden and in Luxembourg, it was really very high. What we've done now is instead of having the yes, no questions, we've got Likert scales, 5-point Likert scales, where you've got a midpoint of neither agree nor disagree. And this has dropped the proportion of don't knows in the sample from an average of 16% to an average of 5.9%. And that's like for like 37 countries in 2018 compared to 2019. This is for the one where the proportion of don't knows has historically been highest, which is upward, the opportunity perception measure, which of course is a very important measure for us. And really, if you think about it, it's really quite questionable as to the value of upward when don't knows are removed from countries where the proportion of don't knows could be 45%. And in the manual I wrote, I give an example of comparing Sweden to the US, and you can just see the difference that it makes if you include or exclude the don't knows in your measures. So we also have a much richer data set from the Knowing an Entrepreneur measure, and basically one of the results from looking at this variable that I've come up with is basically the more entrepreneurs that somebody knows, the more likely they are to be a high expectation entrepreneur. Now, we weren't able to show that before, and I'll show you the numbers in just a minute. I also think that the main attitude questions are now better predictors of T entrepreneurs. Some of you may want to look at that and do some multivariate analysis. Also, I think if you look within your country sample at differences between entrepreneurs who agree somewhat with a particular attitude that we're measuring and agree strongly, you may find some interesting differences there. That's less relevant for comparing across countries, because in some countries people for perhaps cultural reasons will tend to use either end of the scale or the middle of the scale, and that seems to differ by country. So I think that you can certainly make full use of the Likert scale within countries, but we have to be careful about using it across countries. Okay, so I'm just going to move on one slide and then come back to this. Here's the result for Knowing an Entrepreneur with the new measure. And instead of asking whether you know somebody who started a business, we've asked how many people you know. And what you can see here is for independent entrepreneurs and for sponsored entrepreneurs, you can see that the more people they know, the higher proportion of tea entrepreneurs that have high expectations. So it rises from 8.9% of independent entrepreneurs who know no entrepreneurs at all to nearly 20% of those who know 5 or more entrepreneurs. And it's even higher among the sponsored entrepreneurs. So if I just go back to the previous slide and start talking about this opportunity, necessity, motivation, which we've had for 20 years. And the way we asked this in the past was we asked people whether they started the business to take advantage of an opportunity, and we didn't define what that meant, or because there was no better choice for work. And I've listed 3, there might be more, but I've listed 3 implicit assumptions in that statement. One is that there are only 2 motivations to start a business. Second is that they're mutually exclusive. And the third is that motivations to start a business are economic in nature. And there's a growing literature, and I've identified a lot of papers in that 37-page manual that argue against these implicit assumptions. And I've got an example here for you of one of the latest papers, and it's using GEM data. And I think the title says it all: Necessity Entrepreneurship in Latin America. It's not that simple. And it's true, it's not that simple. So what have we done? So based on a lot of previous empirical work and theory, we whittled down from a big list of probably about well over a dozen motivations down to 4. In the Canadian sample, we had, let's see, about 7 or 8 motivations. And we found that 4 of them sort of clustered together around one, what I guess was a latent variable, which we've tried to make more overt. And this is this idea of trying to make a difference in the world, making some meaning. And then the second one is around making money as opposed to creating meaning. So it's to build great wealth or to have very high income. Both of those were separate motivations in earlier pre-tests, and they loaded together. Then there's a third one, which always loaded separately, and that's to continue a family tradition. And it turns out that one, it's quite interesting actually. It varies a lot by country. Then the final one is to earn a living because jobs are scarce. And that's a more precisely articulated version of the necessity motivation that we had before, which was no better choice for work. One of the problems with that one was that it was a bit ambiguous. So in some countries where you had very low unemployment, you got significant levels of what apparently was necessity entrepreneurship. But entrepreneurs can read that statement of no better choice for work in a number of different ways. One of them might be that they're chronically unemployable. They both don't want to work for anyone else, and they would be impossible to as an employee. So we've rephrased this to make it perhaps a bit closer to the original aim of necessity entrepreneurship. And what we found when we've done this is that people seem to understand these statements. The don't knows and refuse are very low. By the way, there is another really important motivation which we haven't included, and that is autonomy. It's independence. And the reason why we haven't included it is because basically it's a motivation that all entrepreneurs have. It doesn't distinguish between entrepreneurs, and so it's not really very useful for us to have in our sample if we want to distinguish between different types of entrepreneurs. So that's why it's not there. Basically, when we included it, all entrepreneurs said that they wanted independence or autonomy. So I'll give you a few examples of what happens when we look at the proportion or the prevalence of high job expectation entrepreneurship broken out by these 4 types of meanings. So this is just if anybody, if an entrepreneur responded to the question around creating meaning, making a difference in the world, what's the prevalence among those entrepreneurs of high expectation T? And you can see that for creating meaning and creating money, the more they agree with the statement, the more that the greater the chances are that they are a high job expectation entrepreneur. Family tradition doesn't seem to there doesn't seem to be a relationship there, and the relationship is the other way, is negative basically for the necessity motivation. So that top one is for independent T entrepreneurs, and the bottom graph is for sponsored T entrepreneurs, and it's roughly similar, really. Okay, so that's just for the responses by motivation. But one of the big differences between the way we asked these motivations in the past and the way we're asking it now is that these are not mutually exclusive options. So we're asking people to agree or disagree with each of these motivations separately. So that means that an entrepreneur could agree strongly even to all of these motivations or to none of them. And that means that we've got 15 different combinations, possible combinations of these 4 motivations. And what I'm showing you here, I realize it might be a bit small, is all of those combinations. The number of motivations in each combination, that's the first column on the left, and then the motivations spelled out. So the first one is creating meaning only. So that's where they agreed somewhat or agreed strongly with the motivation to make a difference in the world, and they didn't agree somewhat or strongly with the other 3. And you can see that only 5% of independent T entrepreneurs fell into that category, and 4% of sponsored independent entrepreneurs. So basically, you can see that there are entrepreneurs in all of these categories. There's no one sort of dominant motivation, and in fact, only about 30% of the entrepreneurs have just one motivation. So that's I guess a strong endorsement for the change that we've made from mutually exclusive 2 motivations to a wider range of motivations, and asking people, giving them the option to agree that they have several motivations for starting the business, not just one. That's quite a complicated table, so I've simplified it a bit in the next one. So here we have the proportion of independent sponsored T entrepreneurs with just reporting just one motivation. That's about 30%, or 2 motivations, which is 33%, or 3 motivations, which is 22%, and then 15% of them agreed with all 4 motivations. So as Puente and colleagues in that paper I cited earlier said, it's not that simple. And now we have the data to show that. So the next thing I want to show is how these different motivation mixes or complexes of motivations can affect intentions, for example. And here's the job expectation measure broken down by mix of motivation. And again, this is a bit complicated, but I want to contrast the distribution of high expectation tea entrepreneurs in this global sample, who were motivated primarily by necessity, to those who were motivated primarily by meaning or money, or at least where meaning or money had what was one of the motivations and necessity was not. And basically, the bottom line here is that if a tea entrepreneur has meaning or money as a motivation and not necessity, they're more likely to be high expectation tea entrepreneurs. And if they've got necessity as a motivation and not meaning or money, they're less likely to. I'll come back to that a little later on, because I'll be talking about that in the context of the other impact measures we've created. So that's what I'd like to go on to talk about now. Nearly finished. This is the second last slide. So the fourth task was around creating better high impact measures. This is clearly something that a lot of policymakers have been asking GEM teams, and this is at least one response to it. What we've done is we've continued to ask about the percentage of sales that are being sold to international customers, but we're adding to that with a new measure of market scope, which is taken from the community innovation surveys. This was an idea of Niels's, and I think it's worked very well. So this is where we're basically asking people whether they're intending to sell on local, national, or international markets, or in the case of those that are up and running, whether they're selling on local, national, or international markets. And we've taken a similar approach to product novelty and process novelty, whether this is novel in the local context or the national context or the international context. And I think that probably gives a much better set of measures for us that we can create combinations of impact from, either in addition to or alongside our measures of job expectation. So interestingly, what we find is that the measures of national scope, or sort of national impact, as at least national impact as opposed to local impact, they seem to be much better identifiers of high growth potential than those which have international scope. And that's definitely an improvement in where we were before, where we were really just focusing on exports, essentially. So the relevant measures here are T Impact 1 and T Impact 2. And T Impact 1 is measuring at least national market and product or process novelty. So it's combining those two new measures of market scope and novelty. And what we find is that this measure correctly identifies 1/3 of all tea entrepreneurs who expect to employ at least 20 people. Whereas the international scope measure, which is T Impact 2, identifies less than 10% of them. So there's a big leap in ambition, I guess you could say, between those who see their businesses having local scope and at least national scope. And the leap seems to be bigger than between national and international. Now, the other thing that we've been able to do for the first time this year is to create measures of impact for intrapreneurship, which are measured in exactly the same way as for early stage entrepreneurial activity. And those are IP Impact 1 and IP Impact 2. And what we find there is that national scope is even better at identifying entrepreneurial employees with high job expectations. So these seem to be better measures of impact than we had before. So my final slide kind of brings us back to motivation and links motivation to impact. So here's a table which what I've done is, and this is just one kind of set of combinations of motivations, and you could think of others. So what I've done is I've just taken the entrepreneurs who had making money as a motivation, and any other combination except for necessity. So they had to say they wanted to make money, and they had to, you know, disagree with the statement around a necessity. And then I looked at the opposite combination. So they had to have necessity as motivation, but not making money. And then I compared these to any other combination. And basically for 3 measures of impact, so that's the kind of high job expectation, at least national scope and at least international scope, you can see that those who had this mix of making money but not necessity had about their relative prevalence was double that of those with a different mix, necessity but not making money. And all those in all the other combinations, which were about 50% of the tea entrepreneurs, had intermediate sort of proportions of impactful tea entrepreneurs. And you see basically the same kind of pattern across these 3 different measures of impact. So there's lots of new stuff there for you for your 2019 reports. For example, in this case, I could have looked at making money or creating meaning, but not necessity. That would have increased the proportion of tea entrepreneurs that were capturing in that particular cell, and compared those to those who had a necessity motivation but neither making money nor creating meaning. And there's other possibilities as well. So I think that's it for the moment. I could also talk about the mindset measures if anybody is interested, but these are the principal changes that we've made to the APS. And if anybody's got any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Yeah, just if I could jump in real quick, Jonathan, thanks so much for your work in this area. It's definitely really appreciative, and has already added a lot to understanding of entrepreneurship, particularly in these nuanced activities that I kind of emerged over the years in our understanding of entrepreneurship, particularly the entrepreneurial activity, you know, within an already established business or sponsored, and is particularly prevalent in these high-income countries where the risk of entrepreneurship is so high. And I also thought it was fascinating the new motivation questions that kind of point to these different cultural contexts of continuing a family tradition. I thought that was fascinating. And I just want to say it's you know, difficult in this moment to think of anything else but the coronavirus. But over the years, in the coming years, as we add to the time series of these new indicators that you brought to the fore, I think these contributions will be pretty invaluable to the literature. So thank you again for that. And now, just want to remind everyone that this will be recorded if anyone wants to revisit it, and I'll send out that link when it's set up on YouTube. Takes a couple days, but and also that document that Jonathan referenced in the beginning, I'll send that out right after this webinar. And now, if anyone has any questions, if you could unmute yourself in a way that I guess hopefully we're not all talking on top of each other, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute and you can ask Jonathan. Thanks. Okay, well, Chad, before I guess we jump to that, Chad asked from the group chat, Chad Saunders, if you could cover the mindset measures, Jonathan.
Okay. Well, what I can do is I've got some slides from a presentation I did to REAC, and I'll stick those up. So I'll just have to stop sharing, and then I'll reshare. Right. Okay. Just give me a minute here.
No problem. That's another way, if anyone wants to, there should be a chat box at the bottom of the screen, and if anyone wants to ask a question through that, that would be another way to ask Jonathan something.
I think that's it. Yeah.
Okay. I can see that.
Yeah. Okay. So so you may have noticed some new measures, and there's 4 of them, and these relate to an attempt we've been making to generate some new measures of what we might call entrepreneurial talent. This is based on a lot of research that's been done by Professor Amatoglu, Gorkan Amatoglu of University of London, Goldsmiths University of London, and then more recently at UCL. There's a website called metaprofiling.com, where you can read about both the research they do, but also get a profile of your entrepreneurial mindset. And they've done a lot of research on this, trying to distinguish entrepreneurial tendencies of individuals. And so far, well over 200,000 people have been profiled. I get my students to do it and to reflect on the results. It's worth doing if you've not done it. There's also a little YouTube video of me interviewing Gorkan about his work. Anyway, we've got a possible model which might fit into the overall GEM conceptual framework. Which is that if somebody has some kind of a latent entrepreneurial talent for entrepreneurship, that should increase their perception of their own entrepreneurial abilities and their ability to spot opportunities, and that should in turn lead to entrepreneurial activity. What Gorkan's group has done is they have found using a large battery of items, 40 items in one, and even more in another test of this entrepreneurial talent. That those entrepreneurs who are have significant businesses or are growing fast tend to score better on this measure of entrepreneurial talent. And we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to try a shortened version of their 40 item battery? Basically, there's 4 different dimensions to entrepreneurial talent. There's opportunism, proactivity, creativity, and vision. And so we asked Gorkan to try and come up with just 4 items, not 40, but 4, which would be the ones that might best measure these 4 different dimensions of entrepreneurial talent. And so he did that, and these were the ones that he came up with. So there's a measure of opportunism, there's a measure of proactivity, a measure of creativity, and a measure of vision. Two of them are positively valenced, and two of them are negatively valenced. The first two are negatively valenced. And these were validated items from a very large item bank. So when we got the results, and we've tested this several times, but when we got the result, it looks like there's a two-factor solution, so that it looks like there's not just one kind of latent entrepreneurial talent construct behind this, but there might be two. And I suspect actually that one of the things that might be driving that second factor is the valence, the fact that two of these items, ones that load together, are negatively valenced, and two others are positively valenced. I'll come back to that in a minute. So the next slide just shows the distribution of these four items across the 50 countries in our sample. And one of the things we were trying to do was see if we could create both some kind of perhaps an index at the individual level by combining these four measures, but also at the national level. Would it be possible to create a measure of entrepreneurial talent at the national level to see if countries varied by the amount of entrepreneurial talent? Now, this relates to a very famous paper by William Baumol, which is, I can't remember when he wrote it now, but it's a long time ago. And it's called Entrepreneurship, Productive, Unproductive, and Destructive. And his thesis basically was that all nations are roughly equally endowed with what we might call entrepreneurial talent. But what happens is that the environment that they're in, the national environment and local environment, varies a lot. And so that affects the expression of this entrepreneurial talent. So we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see if he was right? Of course, what we're measuring here is not the expression of entrepreneurial talent. It's not entrepreneurial activity. It's that kind of latent talent. And what we find when we create a simple index of these four items, and then average them, so you get a country average, you end up with a picture like we've got on the right hand side there of on the one hand, it looks like there are interesting differences in entrepreneurial talent. So where you'd expect it to be low, it appears to be low, and where you'd expect it to be high, it appears to be high. However, this is based on 5-point Likert scales, and so theoretically it could vary from 1 to 5. But in fact, at the country level, the country average only varies from 2.7 to 3.5. So it's a very narrow range. Very little variance in the country mean. And, that suggests that Baumol might have had a point, that there isn't really that much difference in the latent potential of individuals. But there's something in the environment that may be either encouraging this latent potential to be expressed or discouraging it. Now, there are some interesting correlations at the national level between this measure of talent or mindset. So for example, this one, there's quite a strong correlation at the country level between entrepreneurial self-efficacy. So that's the perception that people have the knowledge, skills, and experience to start a business, and the entrepreneurial talent index. So so that's quite positive, actually. That's I guess in a way suggestive that we might not be that wrong with our original sort of model. And then finally, here's a plea, and I think this is the second year that I've asked for volunteers. Personally, I think that there is an issue with positively and negatively valence questions in cross-country surveys, in international surveys like this, because people in different cultures may react differently to an item that's valence negatively versus valence positively. And there is some interesting research around this, and a suggestion that if you change the way you ask the question and ask it in a valence neutral way, you won't get those kinds of sort of cultural interference in the answers. And of course, for us, that's really important. So one way of doing this would be to change the way we ask the questions. Instead of a statement, you would have a question, like, for example, how often do you see business opportunities in areas you know a lot about? And then you give them a range of possible answers: never, rarely, sometimes, often, all the time. And there's other ways that we could ask the other three items in a valence neutral question. And I'd really like to us to try this. So if there's any volunteers who might be willing to do, say, a split sample or something, I think it's worth doing, because it may be, if I go back to this little map, that the way we're asking these questions may be affecting the answers, and possibly if we ask them in a neutral fashion, we might get even better results. Okay,
thanks for that.
That's me.
Yeah.
Oh, just before I hand over, Forrest, what I haven't talked about here is all the possible ways in which you could use these at the individual level as opposed to comparing across countries, and that's possibly even more useful. I've done some simple multivariate analysis, which suggests that these measures are better than the cultural measures at predicting entrepreneurial activity, for example. So there's lots of scope for using them at the individual level as well.
Great. Well, thanks for that. And that's that's something that we can definitely visit going forward if there are any volunteer teams that would kind of like to do these split samples of how you ask these questions. And I think that's definitely a worthwhile pursuit. I know Alicia had a question, and Cesare has his hand raised, so I'll get to him right after Alicia's question. She asked me yesterday, and Alicia, feel free to jump in if I misstated your question, but she was wondering about for the new T indicators, related to innovation with international scope.
Yeah.
As an example, I think she was wondering how we might best interpret and explain this indicator, because in a country, she's on the Saudi Arabia team, it's the results are quite low, and it's just the nature of the indicator, and also the specific context of Saudi Arabia. How would you maybe explain the results when they look like less than 1% of the total population participates in this activity? And maybe Alicia, did I ask that correctly? Alicia, you're unmuted if you want to talk.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, the problem is not my understanding of the indicators. I understand them perfectly.
Right.
The problem is how can we present them in in a nice or easy way for readers at the national reports. Because I had to remove them from the Saudi report draft because well, the sponsors thought that they are very difficult and complex, and that people is not going to understand or read them. And well, that's my problem, because if
Okay.
not, I must remove them from the report, and I am not happy with that.
Yeah, well, I think you may need to read between lines, Alicia. So is it that they say they're too complicated, or is it that they don't like the answer?
I think that the problem was that mixing innovation and scope was not easy to understand. For me it is, but well, they say that it isn't. So
well, all right. Well, I mean, one thing you could do is explain to the sponsors that this is an international standard way of measuring innovativeness. It comes from the community innovation surveys, which are repeated in many countries, particularly in Europe. And it gets around the problem of, which we've had actually in our past measures, of you know, lots of people in lots of entrepreneurs in African countries saying that their you know, their product was new, and it was, but it was new to their local village or their town, but it wasn't new to the world, and so, you know, if you look at the results from previous years, you see highly innovative entrepreneurial activity or high proportions of innovative entrepreneurial activity taking place in countries where you would least expect it. And I think this year we see, we don't see that nearly to the same extent. So,
yes,
so maybe the way to do it, Alicia, is to compare, is to, you know, if you show a table of the way we did it before and the way we do it now, and point out these, you know, differences, and that might help them to see why we're doing these. I mean, the other possibility is, rather than use the combination measures, you know, the combination of market scope and either product or process novelty. I mean, that was just a combination that I came up with, and there are other possibilities. But instead of using those combinations, you could perhaps present them separately, individually. That's, you know, that might make it a bit easier for them to understand.
Maybe my mistake was that I wrote long introduction to explain the change, but they
didn't read it.
Yes, they think that people is not going to read it.
Yeah. No, I think you know, if you have a look at the way we describe these changes in the global report, it was pretty short. And in fact, I've reproduced it in the 37-page document for Teams. I think it's on, you know, page 2 or something. You know, you could perhaps borrow from that. It's less than half a page.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your suggestions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Alicia. I'll move on to Cesare. I will unmute you. Cesare, are you still there? And can you ask that question?
Okay. Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Hello?
Yeah,
Hi.
I can hear you, Cesare.
Hi, great. Hello, everybody. Hi, Jonathan. Hi, Forrest.
Hi.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for this session. Really appreciated and useful. I'm trying now to share my screen, but probably I can't, so it's okay, doesn't matter. What I would like to...
Oh, hang on. I'll stop sharing mine, and maybe that'll work now for you.
Oh, lovely. Thanks a lot.
See here.
Share.
Yeah,
I hope you can look at it. I enjoyed a lot the presentation, and I completely agree with the good reasons why to change. But internal consistency is there, but most of our work, sometimes when writing a national report, is cross-country comparison.
Yeah.
Here I'm showing you the results based on our data for Europe only, because Luxembourg is in this cluster more homogeneous, that is the European Union. And I am a bit puzzled about some of these results. I mean, Poland is really the great example, because it's ranking the first or the last, depending on where it is. I found difficult, for example, to explain earn a living because of lack of job. United Kingdom is ranking really high. It's pretty shocking, Italy, that earning a living built a great wealth so high. I don't know if you made any cross-country comparison and how you can help me to make sense across country now, and if you any advice how to present this break in the series from a previous measures that imperfect but was conveying a message, and we were able to compare year by year to the new ones that my sponsors do not know and may or may not like. Any advice is really welcomed.
Okay. Well, first of all, we've been doing what we've been doing for 20 years without any significant changes. Mm-hmm. And as you know, and you know, this is something that you bring up regularly. The number of teams in Europe, particularly, was dropping off, and one of the reasons for that is that we weren't doing anything new. There's nothing really new to show every year. While we were doing a lot of work in creating these time series, we were pretty well producing the same results every year. At the same time, we were building up this kind of legacy of, as you say, sort of imperfections in what we were doing. And there's a number of ways that we could have done it. Address these issues. One is by gradually making changes over a long period of time, and the other was, you know, what they call in finance a big bath, doing it all in 1 year, and that's what we did. If we look at, I would say kind of the same thing to you as I said to Alicia. If you look at the way that we explained these changes in the global report, I think the main author of the report put it very nicely. So I would point to the way that the global report introduced these changes. As to these specific data, you're Italian, Cesare.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, they make sense to me, given the the state of the Italian economy. They make a lot of sense to me. With Poland, we could ask the Polish team, but I think the results certainly for family tradition, for Poland and Ireland, make a lot of sense. One of the things that I've just moved back to Ireland after 30 something years away. And what has amazed me, one of the big differences between my students in the business school and the students in the business school in Scotland is that almost all the students I'm dealing with here come from family business backgrounds. Almost all of them. There's this very strong family business tradition. And if you don't come from a family business, you wouldn't really think about starting a business in Ireland. So that, you know, if you look at to make a difference in the world, Luxembourg is very high. You know, there's probably a kind of a self-actualization thing going on there with the Luxembourgish, that, you know, they're very wealthy. Luxembourg runs like clockwork. There's no problems, so I think it's a self-actualization story. Probably the same with Sweden. you know, they make sense to me, but don't forget this is just 1 year. So it'll be very interesting to see next year if we run these again next year, whether we get similar results or whether it turns out that maybe in 1 or 2 cases there's been some inversion of Likert scales and that kind of thing. We were able to capture you know, reverse coding that a number of countries had done. And that's one of the reasons why the data came out a bit later, because we were, you know, capturing these or spotting these strange anomalies. I think we've got rid of most of them. You know, when I look at these results, I don't see anything, you know, hugely surprising. Actually, that's not true. I see one thing that's surprising me. So you're pointing out United Kingdom to earn a living. Look, the basic minimum wage in the United Kingdom is very low. People can't afford, well, Mark Hart is on, he can tell us, but people can't afford to live on their wages. And as a result, they're, you know, they've got 2 or 3 jobs. A lot of them are part-time, you know, 0 hours contracts. It's not easy being you know, a low-wage employee in the UK. And one way out of that is to create your own business. So it doesn't surprise me at all that to earn a living is high in the UK. I think what's happened is that in the past, things like this have been masked by the way we asked opportunity, necessity, sort of motivation questions, and now we're revealing a much, I think, a much more sensible pattern.
Great. Does that align with your question, Cesare? Do you have any follow-ups?
Okay. Thank you for your help to interpret the figure. I still remain a bit puzzled to some things, like to see Germany earning a living, one of the even above Spain, even if it's not statistically significant. I mean, comparable Germany and Spain with a really different unemployment rate. I found a bit surprised, but I acknowledge that next year the value of keeping the question the same is that will rule out this problem. But it is what it is, and I really thank you for some ideas to better explain these figures to my sponsor.
You know, maybe what we should do is actually do a bit of, you know, research on this and try and relate it to things like the difference between the minimum wage and the living wage in each country, and see whether there's a correlation, for example, and also with unemployment. So, you know, there's a number of things that can be driving it. If you know, unemployment is high, but you know, unemployment security, social security is also quite high, then you may get, you know, a certain level of people trying to move out, which is lower than in another country where there's very little social security, and the minimum wage is well below the living wage.
Great. Yeah, and Cesare, as you said, and Jonathan, as you alluded to, it's, you know, this is just 1 year, so, you know, as we build out that time series, hopefully.
I tried to correlate with earn a living because of lack of job. That was the most close to necessity-driven entrepreneurs. And at least for Luxembourg, there was so huge jump that strange pattern.
Yeah.
I don't know if other countries experience the same. So what I'm calling for here basically is more not only internal coherence of the questionnaire, but as well across country studies. But I open the floor, please. I don't want to monopolize the discussion.
Yeah, and just one last point on this that Mark brings up, Mark Hart from UK, GEM UK. As he notes in the chat that in the case of the UK, these responses vary quite a bit on age, gender, and ethnicity, and that's something that each team should be exploring for their country's context, whether that's in the national report or other reporting. So thanks for pointing that out, Mark. So next we have Peter. Oh, Alicia, do you want to say something?
Yes, first I would like to suggest Jonathan and maybe Cesare that they ask to Spain, which has the biggest sample in the world, to analyze these variables in deep on what Mark is suggesting, gender, age, group, and other features, because the Spanish database is so powerful that maybe if you ask Anna, Jonathan to do some in-deep research, it could be useful for everybody.
Yep, that's a good idea. I'll email Anna. We've got a fairly big sample in the UK as well.
Yes, but we are talking about a very big sample in Spain.
Yeah.
Okay. And you know that the samples get reduced when you focus on early stage entrepreneurs and established business, etc. But for Spain, these samples are still big. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Great. Thanks for pointing that out, Lucia. And Peter, you said you had you've got your hand up. You have a question.
I just wanted to make one quick comment that I think there's quite a policy implication from the way of categorizing entrepreneurs, because if I understand it correctly, the independent classification has the lowest number of jobs and the entrepreneurs have the highest. So that
Yes.
is
Absolutely.
quite opposite the way that our governments think about it. Because they think of the small businesses, the small independent businesses creating the jobs, but that's not what this data shows, is it?
Well, you have to be careful because at the individual level, yes, that's true. However, in many countries, entrepreneurs are very rare. So what you need to do is take into account the prevalence of these people as well as the number of jobs that they say they're creating. And also the likelihood that they'll create those jobs, you know. If you think about it, the sponsored entrepreneurs, they're likely to have more resources available to them than independent entrepreneurs. So they may well be able to, or may well be more likely to deliver on their promises, and the same with the entrepreneurs. But in most countries, entrepreneurs are quite rare. So I think you need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that, Peter. Are there any other questions? Raise your hand or unmute if anyone has any follow-up questions. Great. So thank you again, Jonathan. We're at an hour and 10 minutes here, which is plenty, but it seems like the team's got a lot out of this. So thank you so much again for taking the time to talk through all of this. And I think this was the presentation that perhaps you wanted to make at the meeting, but due to time constraints and technical constraints, we didn't get a chance to. So, but this has also been recorded. So if anyone wants to watch this back at a future date for any specific points, they'll have that availability through our GEM YouTube channel. So I think, Cesare, do you have anything else? Do you have your hand up?
Oh, sorry, no.
Oh, okay.
My mistake. It's a good opportunity to learn from the past. And now that we are going to change probably the APS, so it's valuable lessons. Really, really good timing for this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Cesare. So if anyone has any follow-up questions or think anything after this, just feel free to send me an email and I can relay that to Jonathan, or maybe you can reach out to him directly. And thank you again, everyone, for taking the time. And I'll send out that document after this call. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Congratulations for the session. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.